We are going back to 2006, and this was a big one. Saints Falcons. Now, for anybody that doesn't remember when I say Saints Falcons 2006, it's easy to quickly come in and say, oh, why'd you pick that one? This, Mike, was a huge game for the city of New Orleans and for the Saints as a franchise.
Yeah, this was the first game back in the Superdome after it was reopened post-Hurricane Katrina. So this is, for a lot of reasons, such a defining time in the history of certainly New Orleans and the state of Louisiana. But I think for the relationship between the two parties, between that football team and that city and state in particular, the bond gets cemented. And this is true with anybody when you go through trials and tribulations, when you go through hardship. And so for a football team to already be something that was probably going to be a source of relief and a source of escape for that city, the way it ended up working out, and we all remember the Super Bowl in 2009, but you talk to anybody and that whole run and the buildup started with this game back in 2006.
Well, and especially in the times that everybody's living through right now, it's a reminder that there are certain galvanizing moments as you start to come out of any sort of a time as a community. So for Katrina and everything that it did, it devastated New Orleans. The Superdome obviously was sort of this symbol of New Orleans, but the Saints at that time were actually playing their games in San Antonio. They kind of gone all over the place. They were sort of nomads, and this was their opportunity to come back, for the city to come back, for the city and the team to come back together. And it really represented a moment of rebirth, but also a moment of ultimate triumph, where it felt like the country was rooting for New Orleans. It felt like the country was rooting for the Saints. And in this particular game, it was the moment that everybody sort of stood up, tipped their hat, and said, well done, New Orleans.
Yeah, it's interesting in moments like this. And I'd be curious, we hear so much of the Saints' perspective of this, and understandably so, what it was like playing for the Falcons. I mean, you have certainly a division rivalry there that people know pulls no punches. But to be in a game like that you know means so much to the other side. I remember we got to talk to, in a completely different sport, Chipper Jones, about the Braves-Mets game, the first game after 9/11 back in New York for those teams. And Chipper talked about being in the outfield when Giambi hit that home run for the Mets to win the game. And it's like, you're the competitor, so you certainly were there to win. But he said, even in that time, you understood what that meant for everyone around that city, and that one maybe even as a nation as well. But you understand what the home team winning in something like that means. And there has to be a couple of guys in the Falcons that in an honest moment would say, when Steve Gleason came through the line and blocked that punt, there's part of you that hears that roar and go, my God, does this place need it?
Well, you're right. And such a fitting moment that they gave this huge rivalry, because Saints Falcons, I mean, you and I both worked a lot with the SportsCenter and Snapchat host and SportsCenter host, Trevor Scales. And Trevor Scales just bleeds everything Atlanta. Anything Atlanta, he bleeds through. And you can just say the word Saints, and it just sort of, you watch it crawl down his back. So for them to give us that sort of a rivalry moment, L. Duncan, somebody we both worked with so much also, much the same, to give us that sort of a rivalry game was actually in some ways, I think, kind of a risk for the league looking back, because you want to talk about already hated the Falcons. What would make you hate them even more would be that moment being taken from you. I think that was a calculated risk, obviously, that worked out, though, because it made the triumph even more sweet.
Well, and it's amazing, like we're starting to have plenty of time to look at the game. And I already mentioned one of the most iconic plays, maybe not only in that game, but in the history of the league, when you talk about what that blocked punt really did. Two thuds in the corresponding call that, and when you look back on it now, have some interesting things that tie them together. But like, you look at who the Saints were before and after that, like 06, Breeze and Sean Payton both get there. Like, what we now see as one of the best partnerships in the league that we've seen in a while was just in its infancy. Reggie Bush was the second overall pick in the draft for them going into that year. Like, it was such a rebirth already for the football team that was trying to really change who it was. And for the city, it was that times 1,000 for what they were trying to come back from.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.